somehow the nuclear industry successfully got our federal government to be legally responsible for their waste. And so every day that we don't take that problem off their hands, we're being fined because the utilities have won lawsuits for breach of contract. This is the kind of crazy shit that happens when we don't pay any attention to what our government is doing.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can't stick to your story if you think it flies. But I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the 205th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Geoffrey Briney. If this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, this is a podcast that typically examines the issues being worked on by Congress that aren't getting covered by the mainstream media. That's where I like to focus, because there are a lot of issues that fall into that category. Because right now, to my endless annoyance, the only story we can seem to hear about on the news has to do with the not an impeachment of Donald Trump. But there are other things going on in Congress, a lot of other things. And so today, we're going to look into a problem that Congress has been working on for, well, my entire life. A problem that, if not solved, can have very real effects on average American citizens. A problem that is not right now an emergency situation, but someday easily could be. And a problem that I was not at all aware that we had until I watched a random congressional hearing while eating lunch. You wouldn't believe how many of these episodes have been born out of me filling my face while watching C-SPAN 3. Today's episode is going to be about nuclear waste and the fact that our government seems to have no idea what the fuck to do with it. In this episode, after I give you the background information that you're going to need to be in the know, I'm going to play sound clips from 4 hearings that date back to 2002 so that you can hear for yourself the debate that's happening within the halls of power about this important issue that is on just about nobody's radar right now. And so to get this party started, let's talk about what nuclear waste is. There's 2 kinds of nuclear waste that we have to deal with in this country: defense waste and the waste that's generated from nuclear power. Most of the defense waste in the United States is the garbage left over from when we developed nuclear weapons, and you'll hear a little bit about that today. However, most of the nuclear waste in this country is generated through nuclear power generation. Right now, nuclear power generates about 20% of the electricity in the United States, a significant portion of our energy, and importantly, it's about half of our carbon-free energy. For those of you who give a damn that burning fossil fuels is changing our atmosphere to the point that it's changing the global climate so fast that we don't know how well we'll be able to adapt as, humans. Basically, the way that nuclear power works is that the nuclear reactors produce power through fission, the splitting of the nuclei of heavy isotopes such as uranium-235 and plutonium-239, resulting from the absorption of neutrons. Don't really understand what that means? Me neither. But here's what matters. The fission process generates neutrons, which generates more fission, which generates more neutrons, which generates more fission, on and on and on and on. It's a chain reaction, so it keeps going. The thing about that is that there is no off switch, which is why it generates consistent power. When it comes to nuclear power, there are power plants, like where Homer Simpson works, and power plants refers to the entire facility. We have 60 nuclear power plants in the United States right now. But the nuclear power at the power plant is generated by individual nuclear reactors. Those are the things that Homer is responsible for managing. 36 power plants have more than one reactor in the United States. In total, we have 98 operating commercial nuclear reactors scattered across the country, with the majority of those located east of the Mississippi River. The average nuclear reactor is an elder millennial. It's about 38 years old. But when a nuclear power reactor reaches the end of its lifespan, it can be a whole other generation before it's actually dead and gone. Like I said before, the reason nuclear power works so well for generating power is that it doesn't turn off. Its power source is like the sun. It's like self-generating, which becomes a problem when you actually want to turn it off. It takes a long time, and the process of turning off nuclear reactors is called decommissioning. Right now, there are 19 shut down commercial power reactors at 17 sites in various stages of decommissioning around the United States. All of these reactors, whether currently in operation or in the process of decommissioning, share a common problem: nuclear waste, which is the stuff that's left over after the process of generating all of that energy is done. Nuclear waste can't just be thrown away because the fission process produces radioactive shit that kills humans, either slowly or quickly, depending on how much the humans are exposed to. Now, that's obviously true for the fission material that's actively generating power, but spent fuel emits high levels of radiation too. Now, those radiation levels definitely do go down over time, but it's a long time. Virtually all spent nuclear fuel, nuclear waste, remains radioactive for thousands of years. Which means that all of the nuclear waste that is generated needs to be stored in a way that keeps it away from all human contact for at least hundreds of years. The quantity of commercially generated spent nuclear fuel in this country currently being stored all over the place totals close to 65,000 metric tons. That number, I'm sure, means nothing to you. And so picture this. Picture a football field. Now put a squad of cheerleaders on each corner of that football field. Now picture all of those cheerleaders in 3-layer pyramids, with the big girls on the bottom, where I would be, holding up a row of normal-sized girls, and with a badass daredevil cheerleader chick on top with her arms stretched out proudly. Now picture that entire football field covered with poison sludge up to and covering all of the cheerleader pyramids, up to the badass daredevil chick's fingertips. That's how much nuclear waste we have to find a home for in the United States. A football field over 20 feet deep. And like I said, because of the high levels of radiation, spent nuclear fuel requires shielding from human contact to be handled safely. And there are two main methods of storing nuclear waste to keep it away from us fleshy radiation sponges. One way is wet storage, where the shielding is provided by a large volume of water in a storage pool. And a good example of wet storage that a lot of us are already familiar with is Fukushima. The nuclear power plant at Fukushima had 6 reactors, and it was located on the ocean in Japan. The nuclear fuel, in this case the active fuel and the nuclear waste, were being kept cool and stored in pools of water. On March 11, 2001, a 9.0 earthquake, so basically an earthquake that came straight from the finger of God, hit off of the coast of Japan, and an epic tsunami flooded a lot of Japan, but it hit the Fukushima area especially hard. The power plants in Fukushima were flooded, which knocked out the power to the standard and some of the backup power systems operating 3 reactors at one of their nuclear power plants. Ironically, in a wet storage situation of used and active nuclear fuel, the power generating reactors needed power to push water around the fuel to keep it cool. Without that outside source of power, the employees at the power company in Japan tried to keep the fuel cool with seawater, but the reactors overheated anyway, and 3 out of the 6 reactors were basically destroyed. 8.5 years later, they're currently in the process of shutting that plant down, decommissioning the nuclear power plant. But with nuclear power, like I said, you can't just turn it off. So far, in Japan, they've been able to remove only the nuclear waste. The active fuel that couldn't be kept cool enough in the water without outside power melted down, and they still haven't been able to remove it. They're hoping to have it done by 2021. Overall, though, the complete shutdown of the power plant is expected to take 40 years and cost over $75 billion. And a quick update on the Fukushima situation, because I know I didn't know this. The power company that owns the destroyed power plant at Fukushima has been collecting the water that's been gathering in the basement of the destroyed reactors and storing that in 900 tanks built around the power plant. At this moment, the Japanese are concerned that they're scheduled to run out of room for more water storage tanks in the summer of 2022 at Fukushima. And so they've announced, just in September, a few weeks ago, that they plan to dump over 1 million tons of that radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean. Of course, telling the world that this is perfectly safe. However, the Japanese are refusing to let any independent labs test the water. So that's how sure they are that it's safe. Now, obviously, Japanese citizens and citizens of other countries are raising all kinds of hell about this plan that none of us seem to be aware of here in the States. Another country that borders the soon-to-be radioactive waste dump known as the Pacific Ocean. But big picture, the design of all three of the reactors that melted down at Fukushima were the General Electric Mark I design, which stores fuel, active and spent, in water, and which are used here in the United States in 16 locations in the East and Midwest. Although I do have to mention that modifications were made to the United States reactors that may not have been made to the Japanese ones. But still, if you're wondering if the water-based design used in Fukushima is used here, the answer is definitely yes, because it was designed by a US-based company. And to this day, 311.5 square miles of land in Japan is uninhabitable because of the existence of nuclear fuel and nuclear waste at Fukushima. The only other section of land on Earth that is uninhabitable for humans is the 1,600 square miles surrounding the nuclear power plant that exploded due to human error in April 1986 in Ukraine, known as the Chernobyl accident. And if you have HBO, or even if you don't have HBO, get it, because they had this amazing miniseries about it that was pretty true to fact. I mean, I'm sure they dramatized some of the action scenes, but I didn't know much about the Chernobyl accident until watching that, and it's a fascinating watch. So do it, Doug. But the point is, that makes 1,911.5 square miles of Earth that humans cannot live on because of nuclear power accidents. And I know that nuclear power advocates get pissed at me every time I focus on these accidents, and I don't intend to bring them up again today after this. But all of us need to keep these accidents in mind when we hear about how safe this technology is. They told us it was safe before these accidents happened too. Everything profitable is always safe until it's not. And as long as 1,911.5 square miles of Earth are uninhabitable due to nuclear power gone wrong, and as long as humans are scrambling to find places to store radioactive waste from nuclear power plant operations and accidents, I'm never going to be convinced that nuclear power is totally safe. And so there's my bias. I have biases, and that's one of them. I am biased against nuclear power because of these safety concerns, which, considering the ongoing nature of the Fukushima meltdown 8.5 years later, we humans clearly haven't solved these issues. So, storing the spent fuel in water like they did at Fukushima, that's one super safe way of storing nuclear fuel. The other way, for spent fuel in particular, is in dry storage configurations, where shielding from humans is provided by thick layers of steel and concrete surrounding the nuclear rods of death. And the way this is done is that the waste gets converted into solid glass, ceramic, cement, or metal waste forms that are typically contained in stainless steel canisters. And this actually seems to work pretty well. The problem is that once this is completed, we don't know where to put all those canisters. And so here's our big picture situation. Nearly all of the nation's existing inventory of spent nuclear fuel is being stored at the reactor sites where it was generated, at the power plants. About 3/4 of it is in shielded concrete pools of water, and the remainder is in dry casks above ground. Now, is this our best option for storing the nuclear waste? Well, the law right now says no. The law says that the best option is to move it out of all of the power plants and put it all in one or two super safe places. And so where are one or two super safe locations for storing nuclear waste basically forever inside the United States? Well, that's the thing. We don't know. Our government and the nuclear power industry is still trying to figure out what the best location would be. The concern in choosing a site centers on the possibility that corrosion processes, so like the breakdown of the canisters, or disruptive events like earthquakes and tsunamis, may, over a period of time, maybe even a long period of time, cause nuclear waste remnants to get into groundwater. And so the goal is to find the perfect location where that can't happen. Now, as far as our government is concerned, the U.S. Department of Energy has had primary responsibility for implementing our U.S. nuclear waste policy for more than 50 years. And right now, this is our national situation. This clip is of John Wagner. He's the Associate Director at the Idaho National Laboratory's Nuclear Science and Technology Directorate. He's testifying to the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources on June 27th. You're going to hear a lot of clips from this hearing today.
First and foremost, I want to be clear from a technical standpoint, spent nuclear fuel storage and transportation is safe, as evidenced by more than 50 years of safe and secure operations by the public and private sectors. We do not have a spent nuclear fuel safety crisis in this country.
Which is true. And I want to make it clear up front that I'm not taking the long way towards the grand finale where I dramatically tell you how we're all about to die. Right now, everything here in the States is fine. There is no emergency. The spent fuel, the nuclear waste is literally chilling. It's all good. For now. Because this is a planning for the future thing. Because a future emergency in this area equals uninhabitable. And so I want you to hear the plan being discussed in this Congress. But to understand what plans they're talking about, we need to know what the law currently is. The law that marks the beginning of this chapter in the U.S. nuclear waste saga is the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. The law was enacted after 4 years of congressional debate that raged because there was an imminent shortage of spent fuel storage pool capacity at operating reactors. They were running out of space just like they're running out of space at Fukushima. But at the same time, there was an equally urgent concern on the part of all of the states that they not be selected to be the home of a super safe national storage site. So everyone wanted someone to take all of the nuclear waste, but everyone called not it. Now, the solution in 1982, in order to avoid the perception that any one state would be asked or forced to bear the entire burden of the nation's nuclear waste problem, was the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which required the selection of 2 long-term storage sites. And to make sure that the end result would not be a single national long-term storage site, Congress included provisions explicitly limiting the capacity of the first repository to 70,000 metric tons until a second repository was opened. And don't bother rewinding because I'll repeat it. Right now, we are trying to figure out what to do with 65,000 metric tons of nuclear waste that has already been created, which is almost the entire allotment of what would be allowed in the first long-term storage facility. But anyway, the 1982 law, when it came to the states' rights part of the deal, well, the law granted states some rights with respect to oversight over waste storage sites within their borders, and the states were given the ability to veto the Department of Energy decisions over the site selection decisions. But that state veto could be overridden by both houses of Congress. Remember that. The 1982 law also made a deal with the industry. It authorized the Department of Energy to collect a fee on utility sales of nuclear-generated electricity in return for the federal government agreeing to collect all of the nuclear waste from the reactor sites beginning in 1998. And so, to summarize, the year I was born, Congress made a deal to take all of the nuclear waste off of the nuclear power industry's hands. And so that's how it became the federal government's problem instead of being a problem to be dealt with by the market, by those profiting from it. And I'm not going to get into the details of how the fee works, but bottom line, which every paper I read and every witness I heard agreed to, the bottom line is that the fee structure created isn't working. The money collected by the government from utilities and the peasants whose power is generated by nuclear power, the fees that were supposed to shield the rest of us taxpayers who don't use nuclear power from paying for disposing of its waste, well, that money isn't going towards dealing with the nuclear waste problem. And so the rest of us taxpayers are paying. And on top of that, like I said before, all of the nuclear waste generated in this country is still being stored at the nuclear power plants, not in some long-term storage facility that is now 21 years overdue. And here's why. In May 1986, then Energy Secretary John Harrington narrowed the contenders for the long-term storage facility, but there was strong opposition from the elected officials in all of the potentially affected states. And so the following year, Congress adjusted the law. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act Amendments Act of 1987 stopped research that was being conducted at the time into crystalline rock, which is the type found in the Midwest and along the Atlantic coast, which eliminated all sites in those locations for consideration. It straight up eliminated Oak Ridge, Tennessee as a potential long-term storage site. It canceled the requirement for a second long-term storage location, and it designated Yucca Mountain in Nevada as the only site to be considered for permanent long-term storage of the whole country's supply of nuclear waste. On top of that, the 1987 Nuclear Waste Policy Act Amendments Act allowed for no backup plan if Yucca Mountain proved to be a bad fit. And for totally understandable reasons, the 1987 law then became known as the Screw Nevada Bill, which I think is a fitting name, especially considering that the state of Nevada has exactly 0 nuclear power plants. And so Nevada was literally being forced to accept full responsibility for a dangerous program they did not create and still don't participate in to this day. Making matters worse, 5 years after the Screw Nevada bill became law, in the Energy Policy Act of 1992, Congress directed the Environmental Protection Agency to develop safety standards specific to the Yucca Mountain site. And rigging the standards like that had the effect of undermining any confidence that those standards represented an independent scientific judgment. But that didn't really matter because then in 2002, after the studies were done certifying that Yucca Mountain met the rigged standards, President George W. Bush officially recommended Yucca Mountain as the long-term storage site to Congress. The following clip is from a hearing about nuclear waste storage that took place in April 2002. This is then Representative Jim Gibbons of Nevada. Jim Gibbons is a Republican, so he's in George W. Bush's party, and this guy actually ended up becoming the governor of Nevada 5 years after this clip.
The disposal of the nation's high-level nuclear waste has been and remains an important issue for many Americans. However, for the past 20 years, it has been the single most important issue for the state of Nevada. And just as a historical note, Mr. Chairman, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, as amended in 1987, selected Nevada and Yucca Mountain as the sole site to be studied for consideration of a nuclear repository. It's very important to note, Mr. Chairman, under this law and its subsequent amendment, a finding that the site is suitable to become a high-level waste repository for the next 10,000 years would require, and I repeat, would require that the site be determined geologically sound. Mr. Chairman, as a person who holds a Master of Science degree from the University of Nevada in geology, I'm probably one of the few geologists in Congress. But I can tell you, having looked at this, Yucca Mountain is not, nor will it ever be, geologically sound. If the site is geologically sound, why so much cost on the engineering aspect of this project? The answer is you cannot spend enough money to make a mountain geologically sound. What will the DOE realize is that they can spend enough to make the man-made engineering barrier sound. The problem is that is not what the law requires. If you look at the fine print, and if you look hard enough, you'll see that the DOE has failed to prove Yucca Mountain's geologic suitability, and they have made promises that they cannot keep. How do I know this? And how do the American people know this? Because once DOE started digging and actually studying Yucca Mountain, they realized they would have to change the rules in order to meet the suitability standards mandated by Congress in the Act. And what the DOE found out was this. One, rates of water infiltration into the mountain are on the order of 100 times higher than previously thought. Two, credible studies indicate a significant presence of basaltic volcanism in and around Yucca Mountain. Three, with Nevada ranking third in the nation in seismic activity, has been determined that there have been nearly 700 cases of earthquake or seismic activity of 2.5 magnitude on a Richter scale or more near Yucca Mountain since 1976. That's 700 occurrences. In fact, about 10 years ago, a 5.6 level earthquake occurred less than 10 miles from Yucca Mountain and actually caused some damage to nearby DOE facilities. So what has been the DOE response to these findings? Findings that even the DOE themselves acknowledge? They retroactively changed the rules for site suitability. They moved the goalpost. You see, the DOE cannot prove Yucca Mountain's capability of serving as a long-term high-level nuclear waste repository that is geologically sound. Their response? Adopt new rules permitting the agency to rely entirely on man-made waste packages. Mr. Chairman, I ask, is this what Congress intended? I don't think so.
So clearly, Nevada's representatives were officially opposed to Yucca Mountain becoming the long-term nuclear waste disposal site, despite W's recommendation. Nevada then filed an official notice of disapproval, as was their right according to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. However, the representatives from the other states chose to override Nevada's veto, and that override was signed by President George W. Bush, clearing the way for the Department of Energy to start the process for a license to begin construction, despite Nevada saying, no, we don't want this thing. And by the end of the George W. Bush years, his Department of Energy had completed the license application and submitted it to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in June 2008. But Nevada didn't quit their fight. This is a clip from a few years later in a hearing in the House in June 2011. This is then Representative Shelley Berkeley of Nevada.
Thank you for inviting me to testify today. Let's get right to the point. Nevadans have been saying no to Yucca Mountain for decades, and we will continue shouting no at the top of our lungs until this effort to shove nuclear waste down our throats is ended. I don't know who you met with, but I can tell you the latest polls show that 77% of the people of the state of Nevada don't want nuclear waste stored at Yucca Mountain. Why? Because we don't want our home turned into a nuclear garbage dump, and we oppose more wasteful spending on a $100 billion dinosaur in the Nevada desert that should have gone extinct years ago. I know members of this committee will hear today from others who will say that Nevada's efforts to stop the dump is all political and has nothing to do with science. Hogwash. The truth is that Nevada's opposition has always been based on the danger that Yucca Mountain poses to our state and our nation. Make no mistake, the Yucca Mountain Project was born of politics, starting with the infamous 1987 Screw Nevada bill. And why was it politics? Because the state of Nevada had a very small delegation at that time, and we were unable to protect the state from the 49 others. You want to talk about science? There's no radiation standards that currently exist because there's no way to create radiation standards to protect the public from a nuclear waste with a 300,000-year half shelf life. Originally, they were going to store nuclear waste at Yucca Mountain. Then they realized there were groundwater problems, so we were going to store it in containers with a titanium shield to protect it from the dripping water. Then they realized that wasn't enough because the titanium shields were going to erode. So then they were going to build concrete bunkers to contain the titanium shields that contained the canisters. And then the last Secretary of Energy in the Bush administration actually said he was going to create an army of robots that were going to go down to Yucca Mountain because man can't go down there, and to be able to protect us from the nuclear waste leakage. This legislation, the Screw Nevada bill, did away with any pretense of science, but it eliminated every other site under consideration as a dump location. At the same time, the nuclear industry and its allies have worked for years to silence Nevada's criticism and to minimize the fact that the proposed dump is located smack in the middle of an active earthquake zone. This is an area that has been rocked by violent earthquakes in the recent past, and we know the risks it creates. Proponents of the dump have also sought to dismiss scientific findings showing that water will enter Yucca Mountain, causing rapid corrosion of waste canisters and resulting in release of dangerous radioactive materials. And dump backers have worked tirelessly to downplay the risk to millions of Americans living along the transportation routes from decades of waste shipments barreling down our nation's roads and railways, with each canister a potential terrorist target or accident waiting to happen. Whether caused by human error, mechanical failure, or a deliberate 9/11 style strike, a massive release of these deadly materials threatens to kill or injure Americans, to release radioactive contamination, and to shut down major portions of our interstate highway system and rail system. When it comes to plans for Yucca Mountain, the fact remains that you could never eliminate the risk that will accompany shipping nuclear waste across more than 40 states through communities utterly unprepared to deal with radioactive contamination. We're talking about shipments passing homes, hospitals, schools every single day for 4 decades. And even more incredible, at the end of those 40 years, there will even be more waste in the cooling ponds than there were when the shipments began. And that's because as long as a plant is operating, some amount of nuclear waste will always remain at the nuclear facility. And that is why the threat posed by Yucca Mountain must be weighed against the availability of dry cask storage as an affordable solution to this problem, and it's available today. Using this method, we can secure waste at existing sites in hardened containers where they can remain for the next 100 years until we figure out what to do with this garbage. The nuclear industry is already utilizing dry cask storage at various locations around the U.S. There's no reason we should not require plants to begin moving waste right now from cooling pools into hardened containers. In conclusion, Nevada remains, in case you don't already know, opposed to more wasteful spending on a failed $100 billion project that threatens lives, the environment, and the economy of my community and others across the nation. I will lay my body down on those railroad tracks to prevent any train that has nuclear waste in it from going to Yucca Mountain. I make that pledge to you and the people I represent. Nuclear waste can remain on existing sites in dry cask storage for the next century, giving us time to find an actual solution to replace the failed Yucca Mountain project. And if anybody watched what was happening in Japan and still has the audacity to suggest this for the people of our country, shame on us all. And Germany just announced that they were ending their nuclear program because they have no way to safely store nuclear waste. If Germany can figure that out, by gosh, the United States of America should be able to figure that out too. I yield back the balance of my time.
Now that is a woman who knows how to use her 5 minutes. I loved that. So yeah, Nevada's representatives over the course of many years fought like hell. And unlike in the Bush years, Nevada actually had a friend in the Obama administration, due in large part to the influence of then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada. And so what happened is the Obama administration fully changed course on the Yucca Mountain project and withdrew the application for the construction license. However, in August of 2013, the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that the Obama administration wasn't legally allowed to stop the review of the project like that, and so said that they weren't going to be able to just kill it with prejudice like they planned. And so right now the project is not officially dead at Yucca Mountain, but at this point, now deep into the Trump years, the future of the Yucca Mountain project remains uncertain. And that means that the future of nuclear waste in communities all over this country remains uncertain as well. And so flashing forward now to this year, 2019, let's catch up on the current conversation, starting with Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia at that hearing at the end of June.
Since the National Academy of Sciences' 1957 report recommending deep geologic disposal for highly radioactive waste, it is clear what we need to do with the nuclear waste. The prudent and responsible thing to do is to bury this waste deep in the earth to protect the environment and public for generations to come. Unfortunately, the path to achieve this is not entirely clear.
And here's Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, same hearing.
Yeah, we have 4 places that 4 tracks we could follow to do something. We could have a Yucca Mountain open. We could build a new Yucca Mountain. We could have a public interim site, or we could approve a private interim site.
So those are our options, and we need to pick one sooner than later because here's Joe Manchin.
Failing to act means that the federal government is racking up more liability to be paid to the utilities to store this waste in their own private storage facilities adjacent to the reactors. So the taxpayer is on the hook here to the tune of about $2 million a day, with an estimated overall liability of $34.1 billion.
Why? Well, remember the deal the Nuclear Waste Policy Act made with the utilities? It said that the utilities and nuclear power customers would pay the government a fee in return for the federal government taking responsibility and possession of all the nuclear waste by 1998. Well, during the 1980s, the Department of Energy entered into 76 fee-for-permanent storage contracts. And I wish I had the ability to go back in time and invent C-SPAN early and find out what kind of nuclear industry special interest bullshit went on to get our representatives to make such a ridiculous deal that favors the nuclear industry to such a heinous extent, putting us on the hook for the indefinite liability produced by their for-profit businesses. But can't do that. And the law right now is what it is. You know, somehow the nuclear industry successfully got our federal government to be legally responsible for their waste. And so every day that we don't take that problem off their hands, we're being fined because the utilities have won lawsuits for breach of contract. Now, it is important to know that in 2008, the Department of Energy amended their standard contracts for new nuclear reactors. Under the new contracts, our government is not required to accept nuclear waste from a power plant until 20 years after the expiration of the reactor's operating license, which is much more reasonable. The companies that build new reactors have to deal with their own waste until their plants no longer generate power for any members of the public. But for all of those old reactors, all of those old contracts, we are legally fucked. And it's costing all Americans money, regardless of if your local community uses nuclear power or not. And so it really is in everyone's interest to figure this out, like now. And so here's what the industry is asking for. You're going to hear from this woman a lot today. Her name is Maria Corsnick, and she's the president and CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute, which is the main nuclear energy lobbying organization. This woman is 100% biased towards nuclear power in every single thing that she says. It's literally her job. Before becoming the #1 nuclear power lobbyist in this country, at least she might be the #1 nuclear power lobbyist in the world, but she worked her way up the corporate ladder to become senior vice president of Northeast operations at Exelon Corp, a for-profit energy company that measures its money in the tens of billions and which is one of the companies most invested in nuclear power. Basically, if the nuclear power industry were a person, it would be Maria Corsnick. And here's what she told Congress in June.
But let me be clear, congressional action is necessary, and 3 important points must be addressed. First, we need to answer on the Yucca Mountain license application. DOE submitted the application to the NRC more than a decade ago, and Congress directed the NRC to issue a decision in 2012. This deadline, like too many, was missed because DOE, without basis, shut down the Yucca Mountain project. For the sake of the communities holding stranded used fuel wishing to redevelop their sites, we must move forward and allow Nevada's concerns with Yucca Mountain to be heard by NRC's independent administrative judges. This will allow a licensing decision to be determined based on its scientific merits rather than politics.
And she continued.
Second, as the licensing process of Yucca Mountain moves forward, interim storage can play an important role in helping move spent fuel away from reactor sites. Moving interim storage in parallel with the Yucca Mountain project helps to alleviate state and local concerns that interim storage will become a de facto disposal facility.
And then the third thing she asked for, I'm not going to play the clip of it because it was related to the fees. Long story short, they don't want to pay fees. Surprise, surprise. But I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole. But basically, the nuclear industry wants Yucca Mountain and interim storage. They just want the nuclear waste off their hands. They don't want it to be their problem. And some other entities that agree with the industry and want the same thing are other states. Other states that don't want Nevada to have a fair say, to have an ability to say no to Yucca Mountain. And so let's look at Washington State as an example. Washington State, its Hanford site in particular, has the most Department of Defense nuclear waste, followed by Georgia, Idaho, and New York has a little bit too. And so this clip is a flashback. This is a flashback to a hearing in the House of Representatives in 2011, and this is then Representative Doc Hastings of Washington State.
My district is home to the Hanford nuclear site, part of the top-secret Manhattan Project that developed and constructed the first atomic bomb. The work done at Hanford helped win World War II and later provided the nuclear deterrence that helped defeat communism and end the Cold War. Today, Hanford is the world's largest environmental cleanup project, and the high-level defense nuclear waste at Hanford is slated to be shipped to the National Repository at Yucca Mountain. Right now, the Department of Energy is building a critical $12 billion plant that will treat 53 million gallons of high-level defense waste currently stored in underground tanks at Hanford and turn it into safe, stable glass logs that are scheduled to be stored at Yucca Mountain. The waste treatment plant, which is the $12 billion plant, which is over halfway done, is being built to meet specifications designed to match the geological structure and makeup of Yucca Mountain.
He said Yucca Mountain. Obviously, that got cut off. But before Yucca Mountain was even licensed, this was in 2011, the Department of Energy started working on a plant designed to turn the waste into material that could only be stored in Yucca Mountain. This is the kind of crazy shit that happens when we don't pay any attention to what our government is doing. And so when the Obama administration deemed Yucca Mountain unworkable for the political and safety reasons that we've heard articulated by representatives from Nevada, they had to mothball that $12 billion project in Washington State too. But Washington State has a real problem on their hands, and that really does need a solution like yesterday. The Department of Energy, so the federal government, has stored 56 million gallons of radioactive sludge, which is left over from the production of plutonium for nuclear weapons, in 177 leaky underground tanks on a desert plateau a few miles from the Columbia River. The concern is that the poison sludge may have gotten into the groundwater and that it could eventually reach the largest river in the West. Recently, the Energy Department issued a new cost estimate for cleaning up the entire Hanford site, and the cost went from $110 billion to as much as $660 billion, a cost increase that no one knows how to handle other than to shortcut the cleanup goals. It's a really ugly situation.
Delaying or abandoning Yucca Mountain means that Hanford will be home to high-level defense waste even longer. The federal government's legal commitment to our state won't be kept, and cleanup progress at Hanford will be jeopardized. With more defense waste slated to go to Yucca Mountain than any other state in the Union, the stakes for my state of Washington cannot be higher, and the risks could be not more real.
But even if Yucca Mountain were built to store the waste, there's a good chance that wouldn't even be enough to solve even the Defense Department's nuclear waste problem, never mind the whole thing. Here's Gregory Friedman. He was then the Energy Department Inspector General. This was from the same hearing in 2011.
Approximately 10% of Yucca Mountain was designated, as I recall, for high-level defense waste and spent nuclear waste. My understanding is that the current inventory of waste in that category exceeds even the 10% of Yucca Mountain that was reserved for that purpose originally.
So that's our government's problem and the state of Washington's problem, which does seem fair to force the government to fix. You know, the government created the nuclear weapons. The government should have to figure it out. But the private sector nuclear waste is also a problem in Washington state. Here's Doc Hastings again.
In addition, Richland, which is just south of the Hanford project, is the home to the Pacific Northwest's only commercial nuclear power plant, the Columbia Generating Station. The spent nuclear fuel from this plant is also slated to go to Yucca Mountain. But without Yucca opening, the spent fuel will have to be kept on site for an unknown amount of time at great expense to the taxpayers and ratepayers.
And so some states, with Washington being just one example, but like Illinois, they're the state that's using the most nuclear power. So a bunch of other states have really screwed themselves, and the rest of us American taxpayers apparently, by going all in on nuclear power without a plan for the waste. Now, the good news is that some other states have learned that lesson and are making nuclear waste plans a part of the licensing process. So, for example, California has adopted a law that allows the state to grant permits for nuclear power plants, but only if the California Energy Resources Conservation and Development Commission can make a finding that the federal government has identified and approved a demonstrated technology for the disposal of nuclear waste, which they haven't. And so no new nuclear power plants for California, a state that is also, by the way, doing just fine with our carbon-free energy goals without new nuclear plants. And after the Supreme Court upheld our law here in California, 8 other states, Connecticut, Illinois, Kentucky, Maine, New Jersey, Oregon, West Virginia, and Wisconsin, adopted statutes that tied approval of new reactors to, at a minimum, progress on the issue of nuclear waste disposal. So those states are doing their part to not add to the problem. But we still have to figure out what to do with the nuclear waste we already have sitting in temporary storage at the plants where the waste was generated all over this country, and the waste that will be generated by those states that are continuing to allow nuclear power plants to be built. And there are some. Right now, there are 2 new nuclear reactors being constructed, both in the state of Georgia. Now, one of the ideas being kicked around is the idea of having interim sites where the waste can be stored by the federal government regionally while the big site, yet to be determined, can be built. And so returning to late June 2019, here's Senator Angus King of Maine talking to the nuclear industry lady, Maria Corsnick.
But if the Maine Yankee site is safe, why not a larger similar site that has the same technology? You're telling me everybody says is safe as an interim step until we figure out what the best... I don't understand why we have to go from 80 temporary to permanent. Isn't there a step in between the
Well, that's what
technological fees?
consolidated interim storage is.
That's what I'm talking
Yeah, and the challenge is nobody wants to sign up for consolidated interim storage. You mentioned New Mexico. Governor just recently wrote a letter. The last New Mexico governor was in support of interim storage, the current New Mexico governor not. And the challenge is because they don't want to become the long-term repository. And until there is an idea of a long-term repository, anybody that raises their hands for that consolidated interim storage is de facto the long-term.
I think that's a good point because these temporary sites are now the de facto long-term sites.
Okay, so interim sites are going to be tricky. And so why not leave the waste where it is? Here's Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia going down that road with industry lady Corsnick. And you'll also hear Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming jump into this conversation at the end.
If you decided today on a long-term repository site, by the time you license it, let's just select Yucca since we've talked about it, that would still be another 3 to 5 years just to license it today because all of the analysis has been done. And there's additional hearings that have to happen. Nevada has to have their say.
But if we're not at capacity, why would we have an interim site? If it's going to be 3 to 5 years?
That's just to get your license. It's going to be another decade to build it. All right, so you're already talking, you have 15 years if you were on go today. $35 billion is what your obligation is today, and in 15 years, it's going to be closer to $50 billion. So you have to manage the liability that you are building on a daily basis, and the best way to help manage that liability is that interim storage, because once you start taking that fuel off site, eventually that judgment fund comes down because you don't have to pay the judgment fee because you've taken the fuel in an interim state.
How far along are we on permitting the interim sites?
You're nowhere.
So whether we started today with interim or permanent, it's the same timetable.
There's 2 sites that have applications in, but whether they will actually go forward and construct those sites is an open question.
So it's not an issue of the waste being unsafe right where it is. The problem is that some Congress, while I was a fetus, made a sweetheart deal with the industry to take all their waste for them forever, and we're getting fined every day that we don't. And so the industry is telling Congress to build these interim sites, which costs us a lot of money, and transport nuclear waste around the country, which is expensive and dangerous, just to get the waste off their properties, or else the fines will keep racking up. And I don't know how this would work exactly, but I would kind of like to work out new deals with these nuclear power companies now that I'm an adult taxpayer and not a fetus. Isn't that a benefit of being Congress? The ability to change laws and renegotiate shitty deals made a long time ago when none of us had any control. And that's a rhetorical question, obviously. Or maybe not, I don't know. But I do think this deal is garbage and it pisses me off. But I guess it doesn't matter since the idea of interim storage is getting just as much pushback from the states and local communities as the long-term storage options are. Consent is clearly a key obstacle to any solution that involves moving the nuclear waste out of the power plants right now. And one of the obstacles, apparently, to getting the state's consent is the fact that it just straight up isn't required. And this goes back to a law passed around the time that my parents were born. The Atomic Energy Act of 1954 gives the federal government exclusive jurisdiction over many radioactive waste management issues. So the feds are the only ones allowed to make the rules. And predictably, when power is given to just one part of government, the other parts get left out. The next clip is going to be of Geoffrey Fetis. He is the senior attorney at the National Resources Defense Council, which is an organization that works to protect public health and the environment. And this was the guy that I felt like was speaking for me in the hearing. And here's what he and his organization believes needs to happen in terms of consent.
The years of wrangling over what standards should be set for cleanup at our massively contaminated nuclear weapon sites, such as those in Washington or South Carolina, is made exponentially worse by DOE's self-regulatory status, which the Atomic Energy Act ordains with these exemptions. The same is true with commercial spent fuel, where any state that is targeted to receive nuclear waste looks to be on the hook for the entire burden of the nation's spent fuel. State consent and public acceptance of potential repository sites will never be willingly granted unless and until power on how, when, and where waste is disposed of is shared, rather than decided simply by federal fiat. There's only one way consent can happen consistent with our cooperative federalism. Specifically, Congress can finally remove the Atomic Energy Act's anachronistic exemptions from our bedrock environmental laws. Our hazardous waste and clean water laws must include full authority over radioactivity and nuclear waste facilities so that EPA, and most importantly, the states can assert direct regulatory authority. Removing these exemptions will not magically solve this puzzle and create a final repository, but I think it can work faster than what we have now because it will open a path forward that respects each state rather than offering up the latest one for sacrifice.
And there have been successful licensing of nuclear waste storage sites in the United States. And so what he's saying isn't just some pipe dream. In New Mexico, for example, in the early 1970s, the Atomic Energy Commission, at the invitation of the local community, began exploring an area of deep salt beds near Carlsbad, New Mexico, as a potential site for high-level nuclear waste. Disposal at the site, which became known as the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, or WIPP, started receiving waste in 1999. And so that's what they're talking about when you hear Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico talking about the storage facility in his state with the witness for the people, Geoffrey Fetis, in the June hearing.
What should consent look like?
Consent should look like regulatory authority, as simple as that. To the extent that there has been acceptance in New Mexico of the WIPP, Transuranic Geologic Repository, the only operating one in the world.
Why do we have that? Why do we have consent for that?
Only consent, well, it's a little complicated and it's not nearly the consent that needs to be there and it's not the full regulatory authority.
But the state
has hazardous waste permitting authority and the state can shut the place down and set terms by which it can operate after it had a fire and an explosion that shut it down and contaminated it for several years.
And we reopened that facility, which I will repeat is the only deep geological repository that's been successfully built that I'm aware of in this country because of the state's involvement.
And so it can be done. And here's Stephen Nesbitt, the Nuclear Waste Policy Task Force Chair at the American Nuclear Society, with another tip for getting the state and local communities to consider storing nuclear waste in their communities.
In addition to money from the Nuclear Waste Fund, the federal government has many means of providing infrastructure improvements, federal land, educational opportunities, and other means of support to states and communities interested in exploring a partnership on the management of nuclear material. Make those potential benefits abundantly clear from the beginning.
So bribe the states. I'm fine with that. The people who live with this shit in their communities should get something for it. It seems fair. But others are pushing back on the idea of letting the states have any power in the site selection process. So, for example, here's Christopher Kautz. He is the former acting director of the Civilian Radioactive Waste Management at the U.S. Department of Energy during the late W. Bush and early Obama years. And this guy worked on the Yucca Mountain license during his time there. Since leaving government about a decade ago, he's owned his own consulting firm, using his government contacts to help industries in return for lots of money. And here's what he told Congress in June.
Because the development of Yucca Mountain has been such a contentious and protracted process, it is being suggested that only consensual siting of these facilities should be pursued. I would submit to the subcommittee that the U.S. and international experience in this area proves otherwise. In my discussions over the years with the directors of repository programs abroad, they have consistently expressed their concerns that due to the very long time frames repository programs take to develop, any political consensus at the beginning can evaporate with one election, just as it has in the U.S. with Yucca Mountain. At the end of the day, implementing a repository program requires steady, consistent national leadership.
So f the states and cities. Keep the power 100% at the federal level. And unfortunately, that's the path the 116th Congress appears to be on. There's a bill called S-1234 that has been reintroduced in the Senate. The June hearing that you've been hearing clips from this whole time was about that bill. And it was introduced by the chairman of the committee and one of the worst people on environmental issues that I have ever seen, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. This bill is one that is very similar to one that was born in 2013 and died in the 114th Congress. So none of these ideas are new. But the zombie of that bill, like I said, S-1234, is currently being worked on in the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. And it's only in the introduction stage, which means that it hasn't moved. And so I didn't read every word of it. But I did look at the provisions that Senator Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada will list in this following clip, and everything she says is in this bill is there.
Section 306E requires the potential host state to veto or approve a site before they are fully informed of a site's local impacts prior to initiating a review licensing process. That essentially leaves Yucca Mountain as the default sole repository. Section 506A gives parity to all other states, yet allows Yucca Mountain and other states in New Mexico, Texas, and Utah to be kept on the list without requiring their consent. And Section 509 eliminates the legal 70,000 metric ton limit of waste to be stored at a repository. So if no state wants to be a host, this guarantees all the waste goes to Yucca Mountain.
And I've been watching Lisa Murkowski, the chairman of this committee who's pushing for this zombie bill for many, many years. And I have no doubt that she is on Team Big Business. Looking at her campaign contribution information, her number one industry, as anyone who knows anything about her will not be surprised to hear, is oil and gas. She's the bitch who has worked tirelessly to open the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge for oil drilling, which she finally accomplished via tax bill dingleberry during the all-Republican government that we just endured. But her number two contributing industry is electric utilities. She's taken over $1.2 million from them that we know of. Two of the companies that have given her the most money for this upcoming election are companies that specialize in transporting dangerous chemicals around the country. Companies that could be candidates to profit from government contracts to move nuclear waste from power plants around the country to a long-term storage facility if it were to ever open. And the list of the top 20 companies that have had employees give Lisa Murkowski money is basically just a list of energy companies. She is simply completely owned by energy companies. And so a bill championed by Lisa Murkowski can reasonably be assumed to be an energy industry favor. And so it shouldn't be at all surprising that her bill continues to rig the process towards choosing Yucca Mountain because the industry is not giving up on it. Here's Senator Catherine Cortez Masto again of Nevada speaking to Lady Nuclear Industry Maria Corsnick.
Under this act, would the NEI support this act if the NWA walked away from the Yucca Mountain project and demonstrated that a new repository project could be done more efficiently and rapidly than Yucca Mountain? Would you support that?
I don't see how another process could be done more rapidly with all of the analysis that's already been done on Yucca. But if you found such magic place, yes, we could be supportive.
Well, DOE studies have shown that walking away from Yucca Mountain and starting over with a repository in Salter Shale could save billions of dollars over the life of the facility. So, and this is the challenge I've had. We've had a stalemate over the last 32 years, and we have offered the opportunity to come in and work with us and find a solution for it. And I think you have that today. But unfortunately, what I see from the industry is the same old playbook and not willing to even admit there's an opportunity to move forward. There's not even a willingness to talk about potential new technology that can be utilized to address this safe storage. And that is my concern.
And one of the reasons why the industry is digging in their heels on this and just saying like, no, we're into Yucca, let's do Yucca, get this waste out of here as fast as possible, is that the nuclear industry is paying no price, literally no price for doing so. Here's Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island.
If I may make a comment, Mr. Chairman, I know that you come from a very strong business background, and if we were running United States Incorporated, the liability of all that nuclear waste we have stockpiled all around the country in dozens of sites would show up when your auditors came. And when you did your financial reporting to your shareholders, they would say, here on the debit side of the column is this liability that you have for having to deal with this nuclear waste at some point. And if it was a $500 million liability, you'd have an incentive to spend up to $499 million to clean it up. But because we're the United States of America, not the United States Incorporated, there's no place where it shows up in our balance sheet. And so we really don't have that persistent economic incentive that a corporation would have to deal with it as a national issue. There's a bit of a carbon price flavor to the point I'm trying to make, but there's also, this is like the reverse of it. There's this liability, and there's no way in which as I can see it, that a TerraPower or somebody else can say, okay, there's a $500 million problem. That means I can come up with a $200 million solution, and then we can split the difference, and I'll make $150 million, and my business sense gets motivated, my innovation juices start to flow to solve that problem. Instead, it just sits there, and the stuff has sat there for decades, and we're waiting for the magic solution to go put it in Yucca Mountain or someplace, but I don't see that happening without a revolt from Nevada. So we need to, I think there's an economic solution here as well. If this was a pure business proposition, there'd be a lot more energy in solving it, because there'd be this account that was dragging on our balance sheet saying, fix me, fix me, fix me.
And while setting a price on the liability of nuclear waste, I think, is a good idea. It would get the businesses to have some skin in the game when it comes to, waste disposal. But we also have to look at the bigger picture of the realities of nuclear power in general in our country, because nuclear waste is not the industry's only problem. Here's Geoffrey Fetis, again, the guy from the organization that represents the public interest.
The actual waste issue, honestly, Senator, has not and is not what is holding up nuclear power's ability to compete in the market. What is holding up nuclear power's ability to compete in the market are its gigantic upfront capital costs. The South Carolina reactors that are now a $9 billion hole in the ground at Summer, and Vogtle, I think, is now pushing $28 billion for 2 new units. The likelihood of building new nuclear power is vanishingly unlikely in this country for a while.
Let me ask this question then.
Now, that said, there is one factor that makes the economics of nuclear power look better, not worse, if pollution were appropriately priced, which right now it's not. So here's Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia speaking to the nuclear industry in the form of Maria Corsnick.
We're decommissioning some nuclear plants.
That's correct.
Have they run their life cycle?
Not all of them, no.
Could
They're
they
being
be?
shut down because in the marketplace right now, the marketplace does not recognize the carbon-free attribute of nuclear.
So
It's
there's
competing
no value to carbon-free nuclear.
Not in the marketplace, there's not. There should be, and that would help.
So the fact that the fossil fuel companies are allowed to just spew their waste into the atmosphere at no cost, while the nuclear power industry does have to figure out what to do with theirs, they're storing it on site, that unfairness does distort the energy market, for sure. And another positive sign, if you're someone who wants nuclear power, is that technology is improving to the point that in the future, it does seem quite likely that this kind of energy generation will not produce as much waste as it does now. So here is Senator Mike Lee of Utah talking to Maria Corsnick.
Dr. Wagner mentioned several small reactors. How much more efficiently would these smaller reactors use fuel than reactors in past decades? And could you describe how these new forms of generating nuclear energy could possibly change our need for nuclear waste storage going forward?
Yeah, so I guess as you look forward, there's a variety of different types of small modular reactors that can be built, but some of the types of small modular reactors that can be built would actually be interested in using a different type of fuel, and some of that fuel could be, in fact, what we consider used fuel today. So in any solution set that we put in, we should remind ourselves that we want it to be retrievable. There's 95% still good energy in what we call used fuel. It's just in a different form. And some of these reactors that are being looked at for tomorrow will be able to harvest that energy.
And we'll be able to use it far below that 95% threshold that you described.
That's correct.
How low would they go?
They should be able to use the majority of that good energy. I would say, you'll be down to maybe the 4 to 5% that, quote unquote, that's left that would then need to be stored.
Which is definitely an improvement. But it means there's still going to be more nuclear waste generated no matter what if we continue to use nuclear power. And we still don't know what to do with the nuclear waste that we already have. Although there's one idea that's intriguing to me, and it was brought up by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island in another hearing that took place in June. In this clip, Senator Whitehouse is talking to Chris Levesque, and he is the CEO at TerraPower, a company co-founded by Bill Gates in 2006, and which has received at least $40 million of our tax money for its nuclear power technology research.
Mr. Levesque, one of my earliest exposures to TerraPower involved the proposition that the technology had the promise of allowing us to go back through the currently just sitting there nuclear waste stockpiles that we have, for which we have no plan, and actually be able to utilize that and repurpose it as fuel and turn, as I said in my opening remarks, a liability into an asset. Is that still a focus of TerraPower? Will it remain a focus of TerraPower? Is it a focus of the industry? And what can we do to help make sure it remains the focus of the next gen or Gen 4 industry?
Senator, you're pointing to a very major capability of advanced reactors. Today's reactors only use about 5% of the fissile material before the reactor has to be shut down and the fuel is removed. It's just the way the physics work. Advanced reactors, including TerraPower's design, much more completely use that fuel. Now, TerraPower's designs today plan on using depleted uranium, which is the waste product of the enrichment process. We can use either depleted uranium or natural uranium to fuel the traveling wave reactor. However, this entire new family of advanced reactors does offer the potential to go and look at spent fuel. Of course, we're waiting for the U.S. to develop a geologic repository for spent fuel. But advanced nuclear technologies do allow you the opportunity to go look at what amount of fissile material is remaining in that spent fuel, and is there a way to utilize more of it? So that's yet another benefit of advanced reactors.
But as great as that sounds, and it really does, I mean, what if we had this giant football field full of sludge that could be used for something that would be great? The problem is that there's no guarantee that that's even possible to use nuclear waste to power the next generation of nuclear reactors, because the reactors haven't been invented yet. It's a possibility that has not at all been demonstrated. And so here's William Magwood. He's the Director General at the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency, which is an international organization created after World War II that I didn't really look into all that deeply, but certainly seems to be involved in all that New World Order type shit, which does not matter in this context. Just listen to what William Magwood had to say about where the companies are at in terms of creating this new nuclear power technology.
About 30 companies around the world are vying to develop game-changing technologies, most of them working on Gen 4 concepts. While there's great hope and enthusiasm in each of these companies, it's important to note that developing a new light water technology and shepherding it through regulatory approval costs at least $1.5 billion. Generation 4 technologies will cost substantially more, and this is before billions are spent on demonstration facilities. The typical company working to develop an innovative nuclear technology today has perhaps a dozen engineers and scientists devoted to their technology efforts and access to tens of millions of dollars. In comparison, I recently visited the Shanghai Institute of Applied Physics, which is developing a molten salt reactor technology. Molten salt reactors are a Gen 4 technology that has high interest in several private sector companies, because it represents the path of extraordinarily safe and efficient nuclear reactors that have the potential to consume waste rather than generate it. The project in China has currently over 400 scientists and engineers hard at work developing this technology, with plans to build a demonstration reactor in the next decade.
So developing this technology is going to cost billions, and other countries are pretty far ahead of us. And I guess I'm just struggling to understand why we Americans always have to be the ones that are paying to create all the new technologies. You know, at what point do we get to use technology developed in other parts of the world with their tax money? I mean, that's how nuclear power went international. Us U.S. taxpayers developed it, and then private companies took that technology around the world and profited from it. The way that regular Americans benefited from that whole deal is that we got the energy from the power plants. And I guess I'm struggling to understand why my tax money needs to be put towards this project when other countries already seem to be on it, and we can still benefit from the technology when it's done and get the power. But of course, the answer is that our government has been captured by industry, and the companies that own our government and our representatives, they want to be the ones to profit from this new technology. They don't want Chinese companies to be first. They want to be first. They want the profits. And here's where we come in, because we need to decide where we want our tax money to go, because these companies want our tax money to go towards creating this technology. Here's Chris Levesque again, the CEO at TerraPower.
Demonstrating new nuclear technologies is the most important step to jumpstart an advanced U.S. nuclear industry and compete globally. No company can commercialize advanced nuclear technology until it is demonstrated. Federal support of demonstration efforts has driven down costs for technologies like solar, wind, and hydraulic fracturing. We need a similarly ambitious effort to demonstrate a portfolio of advanced nuclear reactors. This will take increased public-private cooperation, and we need to start this now.
Public-private cooperation, which is code for give us tax money for research in the technology that we want to profit from. And there is a bill that's moving through the process that would help shuttle our tax money into the next generation of nuclear power, and that's the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act. This bill has passed the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources at the end of September, and it's on the Senate calendar getting ready for a big vote if Mitch McConnell is down for it. Now, the most important thing that this bill would do is it creates a pilot program which would allow power purchase agreements between government and nuclear power companies to be longer than the current 10-year limit. And the agreement, quote, may be at a rate that is higher than the average market rate, unquote. And so price gouging of customers is written right into the bill. This bill would also give the private sector access to, quote, federal research facilities and personnel, unquote, and, quote, to the results of research relating to civil nuclear technology funded by the federal government, unquote. Also, the sites will be allowed to be located on Department of Energy land. And so basically, the for-profit companies will have U.S. taxpayers pay to develop their products for them, and they can poison taxpayer-owned land instead of land that they have to spend money to purchase and to clean up on their own. The bill also authorizes demonstration projects like the ones that the CEO of TerraPower just begged Congress for. The bill says the Secretary of Energy, quote, shall, unquote, enter into agreements to complete at least two, there's no maximum, but at least two demonstration projects by December 31st, 2025, and create a program to demonstrate 2 to 5 more designs by December 31st, 2035. Now, the goal would be a demonstration project that, quote, could be used by the private sector, unquote, to produce electricity at $60 per megawatt hour or less, which is not a great price. Solar power is already at about $50 per megawatt hour as of last year and consistently falling. And as most of you know, my husband is a utility scale solar engineer, and he said just in conversation that it's even cheaper than that. But he's in the other room right now stressing over work stuff, and so I don't want to bug him for the proof that I would need to provide for you in the show notes. And so we're going to go with $50 per megawatt hour. That's been publicly reported because it's still less than the $60 per megawatt hour that would be required of the nuclear industry by this bill. And then there's wind, which is at $20 per megawatt hour. If the nuclear industry wants our tax money, they should be forced to do a lot better than that on the other side price-wise for us peasants, since we would be paying for so much of their development costs. I mean, wind and solar are carbon-free too, which is the main green argument for nuclear power and why so many argue that nuclear power is worth the radiation risks. Risks on the level of making entire cities uninhabitable. And so if we're going to assume those risks and pay for the technology and waste storage for the thousands of years required, shouldn't at least be financially competitive with the options that we have that don't run the risk of making cities uninhabitable? You know, this country has some serious decisions to make when it comes to nuclear power. Mainly, do we want to continue investing our tax money in this technology, especially considering the very real risks and the fact that no one has figured out a permanent solution for what to do with nuclear waste, either the waste that has already been generated or the waste that would be generated by nuclear power in the future. There is no scenario in which nuclear power produces 0 pounds of nuclear waste. There's always going to be some waste. And what concerns me is that this Congress is making these decisions. None of us are aware that this conversation is even happening, and therefore, we're not really being consulted. This is all happening in the halls of power where damn near all of the reporters are focusing on Trump-related sideshows. And this is why I want to continue producing Congressional Dish, even when I hate it, because I want to know what's happening in government while the spotlight is pointed towards the entertainment. I want to know about these debates, that they're happening so that I can participate and tell my representatives what they can do that would represent me. And none of us can do that if we don't know that this stuff is going on. And so if you enjoyed this episode or any of the previous 204 and you want Congressional Dish to continue, please visit the support page on congressionaldish.com and contribute using paper checks, PayPal, Zelle, Venmo, Patreon, anything that works for you in whatever amount you consider fair. The only number I consider unfair is 0. Because I don't accept advertising on this show on purpose. Because that's the business model that requires those that want to make money to produce clickbait. To make money with advertisements, it pays to feed the public garbage that will entertain them, like the crap that we're being subjected to by these ad-based corporate media companies. All the breaking news over nothing when you actually look at it, all the fabricated drama, all the sensationalism designed to keep our eyes on the screen for the advertisers. I refuse to go down that road. And so if you support that, and even if you don't, that's how this podcast is funded. And its continued existence depends on you. And as long as you support this show, I'm going to keep looking for these types of stories because these are the ones that fascinate me. And these are the ones that actually affect our lives. They affect how much money stays in our pocket and they affect what kind of poison shit gets put in our communities. The end. No, literally, that's the end of this episode. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I really enjoyed researching it, even though it's just crazy all this is happening. So there's going to be one more episode for the end of this year. There's going to be one episode in December instead of 2. And I explained the full details of why that is in the bonus episode titled Thanksgiving Crisis Averted. The bonus episodes are where I thank all of you donors who are keeping this podcast alive, and I read your notes and we have some fun with it. And that particular thank you episode, the Thanksgiving Crisis Averted, also has an update on our overdue government funding for 2020. So check that out if you're interested in that. But yeah, anyway, I hope you all found this topic as fascinating as I did, and I hope you all have wonderful Thanksgivings, and I will talk to you as soon as I can. Thanks so much. Talk to you later. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.